fear of communist expansion because of the Vietnam War, especially after the fall of South Vietnam in 1975. Secondly, after the resolution of the Vietnam War, it was economics. Vietnam became a member of Asean in the 1990s. It was followed shortly by Myanmar, Laos, and finally Cambodia, which rounded up the membership of ASEAN, except for Timor-Leste. After the end of the Vietnam War, the glue that held ASEAN together was economic progress, because the whole of ASEAN consists of 600 million people, a gigantic market if it can get together. The problem was that because of the way ASEAN had developed, there was no formal structure. Things had developed almost on the fly. Ministers would meet, they would issue a declaration, they would issue a statement of some sort, and the institutions developed from that. So by the beginning of the 21st century, it was felt by the leaders of ASEAN that it was necessary to formalize the structure, to create, in effect, a framework for ASEAN cooperation. ASEAN's ambition is to become a community of 600 million people. This community consists of three pillars: the ASEAN Economic Community, the ASEAN Political Security Community, and the ASEAN Socio-Cultural Community. All of this is supposed to happen by 2015, this year. But back at the beginning of the 21st century, there was no framework for this, no legal framework for this. Hence the push to have a formal agreement, which became the ASEAN Charter. The ASEAN Charter was signed in 2007, it's 8 years ago now almost. It was the results of the reports of an eminent persons group, which consisted of one member from each of the ASEAN member countries. The eminent persons group identified two major shortcomings in ASEAN. Firstly, the organization was very good at putting out statements and declarations, but not so good at following these up. It almost seems as if when the summit was held, the main aim was to have some sort of declaration rather than to have concrete action. And that was a major shortcoming. This is something that the Secretaries General have identified over and over again. The second major shortcoming was that there was no means of settling disputes amongst ASEAN members. Now, if you want to be a rules-based community, which is the stated ambition of ASEAN in the Charter, you need to have a means of settling disputes. You can't let disputes drag on forever. The old strategy of ignoring the dispute, hoping that it would go away, just doesn't work, especially if you want to create an ASEAN economic community. And this is, as I said, the major driving force now for ASEAN as an organization. When we were tasked with drafting the Charter, the grand visions of the eminent persons group had to be reduced to hard language. And I was a member of that high-level task force which drafted it. And so what came out of the drafting process is not an ideal document. It is a compromise amongst the aims of 10 very different members. And the ASEAN Charter creates that framework for the ASEAN community. It creates a mechanism for monitoring. It creates dispute settlement mechanisms. I should say that these mechanisms of monitoring as well as dispute settlement are not perfect. In fact, if you read them and you see how they work in practice, one would say they are flawed. But they are a basis on which we can work. How is ASEAN going to achieve its ambition to create that community based on rule of law, the community that follows the rules? You need to have some sort of legal underpinning. It is impossible to create a rules-based community without that legal underpinning. The ASEAN Secretariat is the only neutral central organization that ASEAN has. How would you set this up? It would have to be part of the ASEAN Secretariat. Ideally, it should be headed by a Deputy Secretary General in order to give it that heft and clout necessary for it to work. It should be recruited from amongst the best, not national quotas, because national quotas is an invitation to mediocrity. We should be open to having people from outside ASEAN, because misplaced nationalism is an enemy to competence. You should pay the legal service competitively. Do not expect people to give up their jobs in Singapore or Kuala Lumpur or Manila to come to Jakarta to work for less than market rates. This is totally unrealistic. And above all, it must be clear to the member states that the legal service is independent and should not be influenced. And this is probably the most important element of all, that the member states should recognize that the legal service is for the benefit of ASEAN as a whole. They should not try to influence their nationals in the legal service, and they should not try to impose their will on the legal service. Can it be done? The answer is only if the political leaders have the will to do it. ASEAN is an institution that is powered by a mixture of idealism and hot air. And very often the hot air takes precedence. People make these wonderful declarations about having a rules-based organization, following the rule of law. This is the time to show that they are serious about it by creating a proper legal service at the center to support the Secretary General, to support the summit, to support the ASEAN organs, and to demonstrate to ASEAN citizens and to the world that we are serious about creating the ASEAN community.
ASEAN is actually more than the economic community, but economists understand the economics of the community better than many non-economists. Right? For the economists, the benefits of economic integration are actually very clear-cut. Right? First of all, you have an enlarged market. What's the importance of an enlarged market? An enlarged market means you can enjoy economies of scale, more production, lower costs, and therefore lower prices for consumers. Okay? Then economic integration under the AEC also means you have larger resources because you have inflows of foreign capital, foreign technology, and even foreign skills and labor. So it increases your pool of domestic resources, right? And therefore you can have accelerated economic growth, more employment opportunities, and so on. Thirdly, and this is an aspect sometimes is somewhat controversial, economists always believe competition is good, but businessmen don't like competition. So we said that the AEC provides a more competitive environment. What does it mean, right? You have more producers, more suppliers, more imports, so you compete a lot. Now, in the process of competition, you improve yourself, right? You want to do better than the others. So it results in a competitive spirit, which therefore spurs efficiency, it spurs innovation, it spurs creativity. So these are the major benefits. When the AEC scorecard was published a few years ago, there was practically panic. Right? Why? Because it says the scorecard shows that implementation was very poor. Not only that, 20015 and 2015 is coming very, very fast, and yet we are so far from the target. So as a result of which, there was a lot of soul searching and policymakers try to see how we can speed up the process. Now, what are the implementation problems? Right? Analysts as well as policymakers have admitted to some of the problems. Basically, some would argue that there's not enough commitment. Right? In other words, you promise to do what you do, but you never carry out. So it shows a lack of political will. But that begs the question, why is it, you have AEC and yet you lack political will? Then the question is, why is it difficult to implement? Okay, what are the problems in implementation that the AEC scorecard shows? It says, in the case of tariff elimination, well and good, everybody follows the schedule and implement. But when it comes to non-tariff barriers, implementation is very poor. What do you mean by non-tariff barriers? For example, regulations regarding a particular good or a particular service, right? Like say cosmetics, it must have certain types of ingredients that are permitted and so on. So when it comes to non-tariff barriers, it is very difficult because countries impose non-tariff barriers for a variety of reasons, to protect the consumer, to protect the producer, not necessarily because of international trade. So identifying what are non-tariff measures as against what are non-tariff barriers. Barriers are barriers to trade. Measures are if you impose for security reasons, health reasons, and so on.
Hi, my name's Simon Chesterman. One of the things that's always fascinated me about ASEAN is its aspirations to move from being a periodic meeting of ministers to a real legal community. And so I was delighted to get involved in this Integration Through Law project. And the topic that I picked was to look at monitoring. As you think about an organisation becoming a rules-based organisation, becoming something that's intended to be taken more seriously, one of the key questions is whether agreements are actually followed through on. One of the really fascinating things I discovered was that within ASEAN there was in fact a history of monitoring obligations, but it was very inconsistent. It was inconsistent both across the different areas of obligations, but also in the tools of monitoring that were available. And in particular, there was a distinction between monitoring of substantive compliance, that is, following through on what you said you were going to do in practice, and implementation, formal implementation in the sense that you had formally passed a law or something, but less relevant to whether that law was actually being complied with. So what I did in the book, and what I hope you'll find interesting, is look at this evolution of monitoring, because as ASEAN seeks to become a community, that's going to be one of the key questions, whether its obligations are followed through on. There are still barriers. Two barriers in particular remain. The first is that if you're serious about monitoring, the monitors need resources. And so the ASEAN Secretariat needs to play more of a role in ensuring that obligations are followed through on and that the information about that follow through is shared with the members. The second barrier really is the key, which is the historic unwillingness, or at least wariness of member states to actually take on binding obligations. But I think there is evidence in the record, in particular in the economic community, but also to some extent in the political security and socio-cultural communities, that ASEAN is becoming more willing to see its obligations monitored, and it's possible that we might see, as the community is formed, that community will actually lead to compliance. So please, buy the book, let me know what you think.
My name is Edmund Sim, and I'm a co-author of Rules of Origin in ASEAN, which I co-wrote with Stefano Inama of UNTAD. Our book covers the various issues related to rules of origin and certificates of origin in the ASEAN Economic Community, and namely the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement. Now you may ask yourself, what is a rule of origin? A rule of origin is simply a term of reference that applies to the various concepts related to determining whether a good qualifies for preferential treatment under the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement. So in that way, it is like a nationality law, but for goods and not people. Similarly, A certificate of origin simply refers to the documentation needed to qualify a good for the ASEAN Trade in Goods Agreement. In that regard, it could be likened to a passport for a person. To illustrate how important these rules are, I'll use myself as an example. So, my father came from Malaysia,